Take it
So
away.
everyone, welcome to our first Friday event for November. Today's speaker is Michael Winkleman, who is going to present on the evolved psychology of psychedelic set and setting. I've had the great privilege of being friends with Michael for several decades now. We even have published some together. He is has one of the most insightful minds that I know, and the material he's going to be presenting to you today ties into basically in a whole lifetime of research that he's been doing into shamanism and psychedelics and other kind of evolution of religion, things too countless to even mention in an hour and a half. So I will refer you to Michael, and if you're more interested, look at his website. You'll find out more about him. Michael, I'm going to turn it over to you now and take it away.
Well, thanks a lot, John. And thank you all for showing up. I don't get to talk to an audience too often here in the Planalto Central of Brazil. So it's good to get back on the performance side. I think if I'm an exceptional scholar, you got to put a little asterisk like they, put in the sports records. I've been using performance enhancing drugs for many years, LSD, psilocybin, da, da, da. And I think that may account for at least some of my ability to put together things in an unusual way. I recently published an article, and everybody should think about it. It's about the use of psychedelics in the treatment of Alzheimer's and other dementias. And it's basically a review of the neuroplasticity and neurogenerative effects that psychedelics have. So this sort of sets a context for thinking about how we may have evolved through the use of psychedelics. Most of what I have to say here is in this article, The Evolved Psychology of Psychedelic Set and Setting. It started out as an effort to try to put together the pieces of what I've been thinking about many years regarding how shamanism evolved and how that intersected with the use of psychedelics. And as I started to do this, I came to realize that it was going to fundamentally change how we thought about set and setting. Because set and setting are generally considered to be personal, social, cultural influences. They're considered to be your arbitrary kinds of pre-experiences regarding psychedelics, your expectations. And the idea that we evolved a set of dispositions for set and setting is almost fundamentally contradictory to the underlying notions that have dominated the field for 70 years. The idea of an evolved psychology of set and settings is that we have certain innate dispositions that have to do with how it is that psychedelics are going to best work. For instance, you probably would not think of going to a football game on a couple of hits of LSD. You might think of going to the lake or up in the mountains, but there's certain contexts in which it seems that psychedelics are going to be more profitably engaged. And so the ideas that I want to present here is that because of the intersection of psychedelics in our evolution and shamanism in our evolution and their intersection in ritual, that we underwent a selective set of influences to optimize or enhance the ability of psychedelics to be most effectively used in our lives. So, of course, that begs the question, did psychedelics in fact shape or evolve psychology? I'm sure you've all heard of the maligned stoned ape hypothesis. It's nice and catchy, but it kind of puts down our ancestors. They weren't getting stoned, they were getting enlightened. Okay. And in this article here that I wrote with Jose Arce a few years back, we look at the evidence for what McKenna postulated more than 3 decades ago, that there was necessarily an intersection of psychedelics with our evolutionary trajectory. And we outline in this article a variety of different forms of evidence from primatology and ecological studies and evolutionary studies that I think makes a very good argument about why we can use the information we're getting today from clinical studies on psychedelics to make inferences about how they affected us in our past. And I'll weave a little bit of that into my talk today. So the overview is first going to start with a consideration of shamanism. And how did shamanism relate to the evolution of psychedelic set and setting? So I'm going to take us way back into not only prehistory, but into pre-hominids and understand how ritual evolved in the first place. today I think we've kind of forgotten just how central ritual is to primate society. Ritual is the most complex form of behavior, and I'll make an argument that human ritual evolved from a platform that we can perceive even in the great apes today. There's continuity between shamanism and hominid ritual, and that we can understand how shamanism evolved in part by looking at hominid ritual and seeing what's the gap with shamanism, and then also by looking at how psychedelic effects explain this ape-human gap. So one of the points I want to make about shamanic ritual is that it has a lot of extra pharmacological effects, which is to say it stimulates serotonin and dopamine and the endorphins and other neurotransmitters, enhancing their functioning and increasing the overall alteration of consciousness that's being produced by the psychedelics. I'm going to focus a little bit on the concept of mimesis, the idea that we can express ideas through our behaviors, through our gestures, through our facial expressions, and especially through two of the prime examples of mimesis, the capacity for dance and music, which both stimulate endogenous opioids. So I'm going to argue that the capacity for ritual altered states of consciousness and endogenous healing responses evolved in part because of their own intrinsic adaptive contributions to human evolution, and in part because psilocybin was an environmental influence, selecting for those of our ancestors who were best capable of using these substances. And that much of what we see in shamanism are various kinds of innate experiences illustrated in societies around the world and their mystical and religious practices, and also stimulated by psilocybin. When to propose a major aspect of what constituted the shamanic contribution to human evolution is the integration of innate modular thought structures or innate cognitive processes. The ideas that Gardner put forth about the notion that we have innate capacities for things like language and understanding mimesis and emotional expression and inference of other people's thoughts, and just a whole range of capacities that are basically social capacities for relating more effectively in groups. Not surprisingly, psychedelics also stimulate those same kinds of innate modular structures and their integration. I'm going to weave in a little bit about pivotal mental states, an idea that I've been exposed to recently that suggests that one of the fundamental adaptations of shamanic altered states of consciousness is to take states of crisis that are, in a sense, multi-directional in terms of where they'll end up. Psychosis, or if taken into a shamanic context, perhaps exceptional health. And so I'll let this all lead to a bit of an understanding about what a shamanic approach would be to psychedelic therapy, given that psychedelics were probably part of what shaped the overall evolution of shamanism in the first place. And I'll probably have to rush through at the end. Psychedelic somatic interactional therapy. Some therapists that are arguing that this whole thing about talk therapy is completely inimical to the fundamental principles of psychedelic experience, and that what needs to be engaged is something that addresses the body and its knowledge and its way of being in the world. So, biogenetic origins of hominid ritual. Where did our rituals come from in the first place? Well, I'm going to contend that there's good evidence that they came out of what can still be observed today as a common set of behaviors in the great apes. That these are ancient hominid dispositions that were at the basis of our own hominid lineage. These are nighttime group reunification rituals, displays that are led by the alpha male that bring a dispersed foraging group together in the same tree at the night. And it's basically called by the alpha male, who engages in a variety of very exuberant kinds of displays, charging displays, hooting and drumming on trees with the hands and feet, bringing together the whole group that goes up into the tree, begins chorusing and calling and engaging in collective hand and foot drumming. This is a very functional kind of behavior. It produces an auditory beacon to integrate the dispersed troop. It's a way of establishing the social hierarchy again. The members have to submit to the alpha male before they go up to the tree. So no argument about who's in charge here. It's a mechanism for social group integration. It's something that many ethnologists have noticed is a very exuberant kind of joyous celebration by the group. And it also has some very important protective capacities for the group. Not only does it bring the group together, but it makes such a loud din that descriptions by explorers in the 19th century in the Congo and other parts of Africa talked about the natives trembling in fear when these chimpanzees would get together for these big manifestations on moonlit nights. 50 or 60 chimps screaming in unison, banging on the trees, produces a sound unlike anything else. So I'm going to propose that this basic dynamic of nighttime unification with the precursors of dancing, drumming, vocalization, and group integration is the collective ritual dynamic that's part of our genetic heritage. It's been part of what humans have done for millions of years. It's part of our evolved psychology. It's probably why raves and the bar scene have such a compelling interest for people even today. It's at night, we get together with friends, we dance, we make a lot of music, and we take a few drugs here and there too. So the hominid ritual that led to shamanism basically began with this nighttime reunion that provided protection, and now it becomes a communal encounter with the spirit world. And what we can see from a variety of different kinds of effects is that it induces a variety of endogenous healing responses, beginning with the enhancement of the endogenous opioid system and its bonding effects and stress reduction effects. And it also stimulates in a variety of ways the dopaminergic system, which is another one of our feel-good neurotransmitters. I'm going to explain why it is I think that the mimetic suite, which emerged about 1 million years ago and provided capacities for dancing, singing, and drumming, was a key part of this evolutionary development. I think that there ultimately will be reason to argue that the psychedelics may have stimulated that, but we don't have the evidence yet. But it certainly involves a variety of endogenous healing responses that have to do not only with our endogenous opioid system and the dopamine system, but the placebo effect and hypnotic susceptibility and a variety of psychoneuroimmunological and sociophysiological effects. Sociophysiological effects, sort of the social analogy of psychophysiological effects, just like other people and their attitudes affect our emotional and physiological response. Social groups also affect a variety of different kinds of human behaviors, including augmenting responses in the immune system, the endogenous opioid system, et cetera. And of course, the big picture is the altered states of consciousness that these induce. Even chimpanzees engaging in these kinds of group behaviors have been observed by ethnologists who have published comments about they seem like they're in a trance. I wonder why. So how did shamanism evolve from this hominid baseline? Well, first, I think we could put it in the context of conspicuous displays. It's a widely developed notion in evolutionary psychology and human evolution, the idea that when a member of the group engages in a behavior that's very obvious, not only to members of the group, but to other species, it has very important impacts upon others. It's a kind of charismatic performance. And humans want charismatic leaders. Even chimps want charismatic leaders. Someone who's up there in front and acting like such a big badass that you figure maybe the tigers and the lions aren't going to come for you tonight. Beliefs regarding spirits, particularly animal spirits. I think that this has to be understood as a development of some of our innate cognitive capacities. Natural history intelligence is what Gardner called it. And that this provides a certain set of psychological resources, which I'm only going to briefly touch on. But I think that we have to take the whole notion of spirits and turn it around from the idea that these are delusional beliefs to the understanding that these are very important psychosocial adaptations that have important impacts upon our emotional well-being. I'm going to look at the altered states of consciousness a little bit. What did these experiential properties provide us with? And it takes us back to the experience of spirits. I'll look a little bit at ritual as being an intrinsically healing kind of process, where bringing the group together, giving a sense of protection and giving us a powerful leader who's standing up in front of us and making lots of protective sounds is something that enables us to reduce stress, relax, and engage in a variety of self-care behaviors. And then we have the information that comes from the altered states. The mythic explanations I'll only briefly touch on, but I think ultimately the altered states give us experiences. I mean, for some reason, the evolutionary psychology of religion is still stuck in trying to explain why humans came up with these deluded ideas. They're a natural psychology, out-of-body experiences, soul journeys. These are natural experiences, not invented, and they demand an explanation that goes beyond the personal to extrapersonal domains. Ultimately, I think we have to accept the role of psychedelics, psilocybin in particular, in the evolution of shamanism, evolution of religion, because contemporary clinical studies show us that psilocybin has the objective ability to induce mystical experiences. You do double-blind clinical studies, and 60% of the people in the psilocybin group have pretty complete mystical experiences. Only one person out of all the years of the Johns Hopkins study had any thing that resembled a mystical experience at all when they were in the control group, and they had at the lowest level. So ultimately, I think that psilocybin has to be brought into the picture of explaining not only how evolution of humans' ritual capacities of shamanism evolved, but ultimately perhaps even how our whole cognitive suite of capabilities emerged in the cultural niche. The idea here is psychedelic instrumentalization. Forget this notion that drugs are bad for you. When you look at drugs, they make you stay up when you need to stay up. They let you relax when you need to relax. They help you get it up when you need to get it up. They help you get down when you need to relax and chill out. And sometimes they induce these powerful experiences in which everything is connected together. So the idea of psychedelic instrumentalization is just an extension of what's called the drug instrumentalization paradigm. And Arce and I review that and look at how this applies to psychedelics. It's interesting that the evolutionary psychologists are all hyped up about how all these other drugs are important contributions to human evolution, but mention psychedelics and they reject your paper from the journal. We have still a real powerful academic censoring going on in terms of applying the same rules to psychedelics as they apply to the other drugs, but they give us experiences of a spiritual reality. They stimulate wakefulness and dancing, keep you up overnight. They give you visionary experiences, death and rebirth experiences, which are linked to self-transformation or frequent occurrences. Power animals occur a lot, particularly in the context of pre-modern societies. And the idea of innate, inherent healing energies moving through your body and being transferred to others is a frequent experience of people who engage in healing and then take psilocybin. So this plus the visionary information, the cosmological system of an animated nature, all this has to be understood as part of the package that was brought into human culture and behavior through the influences of psychedelics. And in case I don't get a chance to throw it in somewhere else, we need to get rid of this idea that people are having hallucinations on psychedelics. They are having symbolic experiences that are an innate symbol system presented in images and should be understood as an exaptation of the same kind of visual system that functions in dreams. So I've been looking at these ideas of a coevolution for quite some time. This article, I think, was in 2013. The idea being that when we really understand how psychedelics affect human behavior, we can't ignore the fact that they had a significant role in how humans behaved in the past. And beyond that, they had an important role in creating these features of shamanism. So briefly, I'm going to sort of shift gears here and talk about shamanism. This is one of the things that been looking at since the 80s, using cross-cultural studies to better understand what are the features. And briefly here, I want to contend, and you can see this in a number of my articles and in the Shaman, Priest, and Witches book, there's a similar dynamic of ritual behavior in societies around the world that turn out to be mostly these pre-modern, simple agricultural or foraging societies. Nighttime rituals, extensive drumming and dancing and chanting and singing, having a spirit encounter, visions, the shaman being trained alone in the wilderness, the vision quest, fasting, sexual abstinence, and austerities being a very important set of preparatory features, experiences of initiatory death, the death and rebirth cycle that involves animals that first kill you and then become your powers and protectors, and then the altered states of consciousness that we see around the world, the so-called soul flight or astral projection, out-of-body experience, as well as the near death. And then healing things such as soul loss, extraction of objects that are sent by sorcery or other forms of sorcery. So these are things that we see in cultures around the world in the pre-modern society, and I've documented this in my cross-cultural research, going back to the 80s. Plus some recent updates that I think have some very interesting new implications. So why is it cross-cultural? It's based upon this hominid pre-human collective ritualization. And when any species evolves, doesn't invent something altogether new, evolution works with what's at hand. Evolution works with the existing capacities. So if we want to ask the question, how did human ritual evolve? Then the logical place to look for the basis is in the most complex rituals of our chimpanzee cousins. And appropriately, the chimpanzee rituals that I'm using as a model are called maximal display. It's the biggest, most complex ritual that the chimps do. Interestingly, there's homologies to that in the gibbons and also in orangutans, not as much, but some because they're more solitary animals, and in the apes. So all the hominids have this same basic suite of collective ritualization with drumming and vocalization that brings the group together. Other things that I think are explanations of why shamanism was cross-cultural in foraging societies, it has to do with the psychobiology of altered states of consciousness. Altered states are not some arbitrary set of features that occur. They're very regularly reproduced with a variety of behaviors that have specific effects upon the autonomic nervous system and also the global brain dynamics. And I'll focus a bit on that. The idea that the overall dynamic of altered states is a shift of the brain dynamic from a top-down to a bottom-up expressive capacity. The mimetic suite, this capacity for dance, drumming, expressive behavior, emotional expression, etc., recognized as a milestone in human evolution. Only a few people have tied it back to the notion of, well, this is where ritual got its big boost when we could engage in a variety of enactments. We also have a variety of endogenous healing responses that occur to ritual. Placebo effect, hypnotic effect, dissociative effects are all part of what ritual produces, and they're all intrinsically related to our own intrinsic ability to enter into healing states. The innate intelligence, I think, explained many aspects of shamanism and even religion. The spirit hypothesis, if we'll take that term, is basically the ability to use the innate intelligences to infer human qualities where there's not a physical human. The ability to infer theory of mind, to infer what others expect of us, to infer their social postures, to incorporate their ideas for our behavior. Music is considered an innate intelligence. Animals are considered to be an innate intelligence. When you look at the whole suite of characteristics of shamanism and foraging societies, they map onto the innate intelligences, and I'll come back to that in the end here. And then exploiting pivotal mental states, the idea that when we enter into a crisis and our ego structures start to break down, there are a number of different ways that we can respond. We can further digress, degenerate, and become dysfunctional, or we can adopt a new model of dealing with the world. And that's what shamanism did. It adopted the notion that these animals are not here to eat me, they're here to protect me, and I'm going to be able to use them to do a lot of important things. Altered states of consciousness as set and setting for psychedelics and for shamanism. If you look at the shamanic behaviors, typically they replicate in a short period of time what was the training experience: fasting, social isolation, sexual abstinence, prolonged periods of sleeplessness, and sometimes psychedelics. They have overnight ceremonies. This is what's typical of shamanism. You start 8, 10, 9, and you go to the next morning. And because during this period of time, the shaman actually lays down and is covered by a blanket and attended to, you have this automatic incorporation of dream processes. So while a number of anthropologists have discussed shamanic kinds of practices in terms of dream time, I don't think we have yet fully exploited the understanding of dream processes as a core aspect of what was exapted into shamanic functions by virtue of overnight ceremonies. And then we have the song and dance. Continuity from the hominid behaviors. It stimulates not only the endogenous opioid system, but clinical evidence shows that it enhances the dopaminergic system, serotonergic system, and even the endocannabinoid system is stimulated by extensive dancing, extensive movement of the body, such as in long distance running. So this is sort of like what was part of the extension of what the hominid basis gave us before we ever got on to using the psychedelics. So my general model of altered states of consciousness: deregulation of the areas that are key to higher mental processes, the prefrontal cortex and the default mode network. The prefrontal cortex basically enabling this top-down control of the frontal cortex of the lower brain structures, the default mode network being an important part of the prefrontal cortex that links up the lower levels of the brain, particularly related to autobiographical memory, self-concept, with the frontal cortex. A lot of the research in psychedelics in recent years has pointed out that one of the primary effects of psychedelics on the brain is disabling the default mode network, the way that we ordinarily think about ourselves and our personal history. What happens as a consequence of taking these top-down systems offline is that you get the release of the systems that are normally repressed. One of the functions of serotonin in the brain is to repress the activities of the lower brain systems. So you're not distracted by too much information, not distracted by your preoccupations, your unconscious, your emotions. And what happens under the psychedelics, as well as under these other kinds of methods of inducing altered states, is that you get the deregulation of the serotonergic inhibition and the release of a bottom-up brain dynamic that liberates the unconscious mind, liberates the innate intelligences and cognitive operators, and produces an ascending, bottom-up, highly synchronous theta wave discharge that ascends through the neuraxis and imposes the brain patterns coming from the lower brain systems into the frontal cortex. So basically, altered states and psychedelics turn the dynamics of the brain upside down. You can think of it as taking the personal and cultural brain offline and putting our innate unconscious brain as the driver. So I've elaborated on some of these ideas here in this article in Frontiers in Neuroscience on mechanisms of psychedelic visionary experiences. I think evolutionary psychology gives us some understandings of where these experiences are coming from, and they're coming from the liberation of these lower brain systems. And in particular, I think we will ultimately be able to link it to the way in which mimesis functions in the brain. So that's my hypothesis here, but it's a far broader article in terms of understanding a variety of aspects of the evolution of our brain in relationship to altered states and psychedelics, and ultimately how this can provide us with a neural phenomenological understanding of psychedelic experiences, which is to say that a lot of what we experience on psychedelics have to do with the way our neurological systems are shifted by the effects that they have on our brain dynamics. Oh, and the point that I had across the top, people are arguing that psychedelics produces an anarchic brain. It's out of control. No, it's not out of control. It's being controlled by the archaic brain or ancient brain. That has important implications for how we come to see the world differently. So the core of shamanic evolution has to be seen as involving mimesis. There was probably relatively little that evolved in terms of hominin ritual from the chimpanzee divergence up into mimesis. But with mimesis, we got the capacity for culture, for expression, for shared information, for recounting what happened to us during the day through pantomime. And this multimodal expressive capacity has a lot of different ways in which it can be expressed and in which it is intuitively understood. Basically, it allows us to use the body as a metaphor, as a generative expressive system that gives us the capacity to share symbolic meanings. These are symbolic meanings in the sense that they are representations of what happened before, but these inactive metaphors are also intuitively understood. Why? Because they're mediated by their mirror neurons. This is a neuron system that we have that has a dual purpose. The dual purpose is that on one hand, they fire when we are engaging in an intentional behavior. So if I reach for an apple, that reaching mirror neuron fires. If I watch you reach for something, the same neuron fires. So your behavior automatically triggers my mirror neurons and tells me exactly what your intentions are. It's an innate intrinsic system of meaning. So the core notions of the mimetic suite have been embodied in understanding of shamanism since the beginning of the academic studies. The drum being one of these key features, the songs of the shaman being a key feature, the overnight dance of the shaman being key features. Drumming, singing, dancing, going all the way back to our hominid roots, but put on steroids in human evolution because, the chimps dancing is pretty short, 15, 20 seconds. The drumming, about the same, average length of drumming, 12 seconds and about. Vocalization is relatively limited, but wait till shamans get a hold of it and it goes basically all night. So mimetic consciousness also provides for an ability to have an understanding of others. It provides the capacity not only for perceiving others' mindsets and their thoughts, but virtually it produces an identity with others. Why? Because your brain's firing the same way their brain is firing. The kinds of behaviors that are wired into your brain learning is also wired into their brain's learning. The same dynamic is being expressed. And so the idea that we start to have a sense of we are like others comes from this capacity of mimesis. And so in deep evolutionary time, this provided a basis for a social consciousness where we felt like others because mimesis triggered our mirror neurons. And so this mimetic capacity with a ability to produce empathy gave us an ability to want to help others, to feel that we should help them feel better. And probably is what was at the basis of the shamanic motivation. It wasn't just the alpha male, the chimp running into the darkness, yelling and beating on the trunks. It was somebody turning to you and say, I feel what you feel. And now you need to feel what I feel because my feelings can change yours. So there's a variety of endogenous healing processes or responses that are elicited by ritual engagement. The dramatic display, whether you look at it from the hominid point of view or from the shamanic point of view, induces innate healing responses. the parasympathetic response, the stimulation to relaxation, counteracts stress. Participating in ritual induces an increase in hypnotic susceptibility. Contemporary studies show that you get people to sort of engage in little things together, clap together or make movements, synchronous movements together. All of a sudden, they like the other person better. They think they're better people, and they become more susceptible to hypnosis and placebo responses. So what we had in the context of ritual, I think, was the emergence of healing as a side effect. That once our ancestors recognized it, they then could turn back to ritual as a capacity to deliberately induce our endogenous healing responses. And you may note here that I use the placebo response rather than the placebo effect, which is more widely used, because what this understanding leads us to is a recognition of how the individual responds to the setting, the environment, the healing. Certainly an important dynamic that underlies our psychoneuroimmunological responses as well. So this kind of response is not just from the dynamics of ritual, but also from the very specific effects that come out of music. Music is one of the innate intelligences. It's considered an aspect of mimesis. And we know from contemporary clinical studies that music has a capacity to elicit biologically determined emotional states. Music certainly can have some arbitrary features to it, but what it typically does is elicit a particular kind of emotional setting. And you're probably very aware some music makes you feel happy and relaxed, and some music puts you on edge, and some music can just put you into like an agitated state. Music has physiological capacities. Some cross-cultural studies have discovered that probably 60%, I think it was, of all music that ever has been written is about loving relationships. So I think that this takes us back into the evolutionary origins of music that not only function as a mechanism for inducing coordination and expressing emotions, but inducing relaxation, emotional harmony, and transforming traumatic emotions and traumatized people into a different emotional set and setting, a different complex. First, perhaps eliciting and then releasing the emotions and then changing the emotions altogether. Music is a very important capacity in terms of coordinating human behavior. It's an important way of coordinating interpersonal relationships. I suspect you will have found out over time that it's hard to get involved in a long-term close relationship to someone who plays music that you just don't like. On the other hand, people often bond over music, and we have our favorite songs from who knows how many years ago. So I think that when we have a more full understanding of mimesis, we're going to understand that it was the origins of religious behavior. For a variety of reasons, we can't really call the hominid collective ritual dynamic religion. There's many missing elements. But I think by the time we get to mimesis, we have all the capacities necessary for meeting criterion of religion, expressing beliefs, sharing moral systems, etc. Contemporary evolutionary psychology of religion says we got to have language before we have religion. I think that ultimately, this is where we're going to understand the origins of religion. 1,000,000 years ago, and the emergence of the capacity of shamanism to use ritual and music and dance and drumming and dramatic performances to transform traumatic emotions and traumatized emotions into happy bonding groups of people. Of course, dance is part of that. And something I've yet to see is an analysis of conspicuous displays in terms of dance. All the elements of dance are typically there in conspicuous displays. These are these kinds of very obvious behaviors that animals make that call attention to themselves. And it first became an issue of interest to ethologists because it appeared that some animals engage in attention calling behaviors in the presence of predators. And you might think, if a predator's showing up, why do you want to start jumping up and down and making a lot of noise? Well, ultimately, they came to see this as a display of excessive fitness, an interspecies communication saying to the predator, I see you and you see me, and you know I see you, and you can see me jumping up and down here. I'm not worried about getting tired running away from you. I got energy to spend. And at the same time, the display is signaling to relatives and members of the group, hey, I just saw something that you should be paying attention to as well. So this deep history of, or prehistory of conspicuous displays undoubtedly was part of what led to the emergence of dance as another kind of conspicuous display, but one more oriented towards the in-group, showing coordination, showing excessive fitness, and showing a behavioral dynamic of being exceptionally well fit. Dance also induces altered states of consciousness, particularly the sympathetic stimulation, which if you lay down goes to the parasympathetic phase. But as we know from whirling dervishes and other kinds of dance and trance induction, the ability to enter an altered state of consciousness while dancing on your feet is possible. You can become totally dissociated, the body takes over, you're gone to the spirit worlds, and your body continues to function. The concept of habitus, or body realities, behaviors, and expressions, I think is an important issue here. It's often seen as being an expression of our unconscious dynamics. And dance, I think, is one of the kinds of tools that can express those dynamics and also modify personal dispositions, emotional, social sensibilities. Dance can change the way we feel, much in the same way that music can change the way we feel. It has to do with the intrinsic effects upon our body. Dance therapy, something that wasn't widely recognized 20, 30 years ago, but is something intrinsic to cultures around the world. Not universal, perhaps, but certainly you will find in many different cultures where dance is used therapeutically because it liberates repressed emotions. It liberates unconscious dynamics. And through that liberation provides intrinsic therapeutic effects. I think one of the dynamics would be the same kind of issue that we see with the interference with the default mode network, the interference with ego control. And this interference with ego control then allows the innate intelligences to be expressed. So it also allows for the expression of these ancient ways of conveying our mood and shifting moods and promoting psychological integration, and I would say social integration. People dancing together have very powerful senses of being a group. Seeing other people dancing together gives an impression that the group is bigger and more powerful than it really is. Entheogenic experiences, I think, have to be understood as innate intelligences. First, I would say that the altered states elicit and integrate these innate social intelligences. When we look at the components of spirits, well, they are presence, they have a mind, they normally have some message for us, they have something that we need to pay attention to. I mean, this is the fundamental tools for becoming a human being. You pay attention to other people around you, you figure out that they're trying to tell you something, and you figure out what it is that they want you to do. When we look at the basic dynamics of spirits, I think that we see what is the core of our innate intelligences integrated. And when you look at what our spirit experiences today of psychedelic induced spirits, the so-called DMT entities, all of these are human-like in their appearances even, not just their behavior. They're showing the unconscious cognitive structures of our brain. And I think that these are sort of understood best as synesthetic integrations of innate modular capacities. We combine together our different innate modular capacities into a overall dynamic. A spirit, something that's like human, has human-like qualities, perhaps even better than human qualities. And it was part of our search for unseen mechanisms, unseen causal mechanisms. So in the book that John and I edited a few years back, Supernatural After the Neural Turn, Charlie Laughlin has a very good article in there in which he would contend that basically the spirit hypothesis is the evolution of our capacity to postulate spirit causal mechanisms in the world that we can't directly intuit or understand, but we inevitably, and this is my words now, postulate these mechanisms as somehow being like what we understand best, us, ourselves. So the ontology of psychedelic entity experiences in evolutionary psychology and neurophenomenology was another one of these papers that sort of emerged out of a conference presentation, but ultimately I was led down this path of evolutionary psychology as being the explanation of the major dynamics that we encounter in psychedelic experiences. So here, psychedelics, shamanic set and setting. The left side, gardeners' innate intelligences. On the right side, what we see as central parts of shamanism. And they match up in some very compelling ways by my way of thinking. Every one of the innate intelligence has something comparable in terms of what shamanism is engaged in. And I think this, to me, would be part of the overall argument that what led to shamanism was the capacity of ritual and ritual altered states of consciousness to integrate our innate intelligences in ways that produce more complex representations of the world. And in this sense, it's this ability to put, the mind's capacity, our own awareness, and our theory of mind together that gives us this understanding of spirits. And similarly, many of these other intelligences are linked together in the performance of shamanic ritual. This leads us to an animistic cosmology as a neural theology. I mean, the evolutionary psychology of religion is still engaged with why we were deluded into thinking that there were spirits, but in fact, spirits are intrinsic structures of our consciousness. This is the way we normally perceive the world. Animism is a normal and natural way of understanding the external world. And I think that in many ways, this animistic cosmology not only speaks to our deeply unconscious cognitive processes, but expresses the variety of different kinds of behavioral and emotional communication functions of our brain. So here, the notions here that I take from Paul MacLean's triune brain: proto-mentation, emotio-mentation, cognitive capacities linked to our ancient brain systems, are systems that still are functioning in terms of expressing our unconscious, in terms of expressing our relationships to the world and to others, expressing our innate intelligences, expressing these innate capacities for emotional and social and mental engagement with the world. And one of the things that come out of this is the innate capacity to incorporate our animal intelligence as an animal identity that becomes the alter ego that expands our capacity for a variety of different kinds of cognitive, emotional, and social functions. Humans do better with help. And when the people around us aren't giving us the help we need, then the help we get from the animals becomes a significant source of empowerment. So I would like to think of the psychedelic visions as an innate visualization process that happens automatically with the disinhibition of the dopaminergic system. It releases this information-rich visual capacity. If dreams are symbolic, then hallucinations are symbolic. And we don't want to call them hallucinations anymore because it's a misnomer. These aren't something that's a false perception. It's a symbol that represents something coming out of the psyche. And what's coming out of the psyche? One of the things we see in psychedelics is the increased connectivity across not only the visual brain regions, or within the visual brain regions, but between the visual brain regions and other parts of the brain, and ultimately an enhanced connectivity between all of the brain. So we're putting a bigger picture together, but it's not a picture that runs through the left hemisphere and the language centers as the source of integration and elevation. It's coming through the primary processing visual capacities that then gives us images of what's going on in the world. So this has been discussed. Woman philosopher Suzanne Langer, as I recall, came up with the idea of presentational symbolism. They say it was ignored in philosophy because it came from a woman. I think it was probably also ignored because it's so contrary to our notions that symbolism has to do with words. But symbolism is a far more ancient system that existed at least 1 million years ago. It's a natural system that expresses unconscious brain processes. It represents our internal mental life for us, and ultimately it can represent what we experience in these spiritual worlds. I'm going to go over this a little more quickly here. I'm seeing I'm coming to the end of my time here, I think 10 minutes left maybe. Dreaming. We have to explore dreaming not only with respect to the origins of shamanism, but ultimately we have to see it as being a so far little exploited tool in the psychedelic renaissance. You look at indigenous cultures, yeah, dreaming was an important part of shamanism. Dreaming was an important part of the continuation of shamanic ritual, important expansion of the entheogenic experience, part of the entheogenic experience. What it tells us is we need to focus on these images that come out of the unconscious. Soul journeys. I think we need to explore these more as a way of decentering our ego-bound ways of seeing the world and engaging this visual symbolic capacity that operates independent of our rational brain, and perhaps it's a form of mimetic thinking independent of the physical body. A number of psychologists have proposed this is an innate capacity that takes the perspectives of others towards ourselves, and that also provides a tool for integrating or disintegrating a variety of different self structures. Same for the death and rebirth experiences. You know, a lot of times people say, I'm so afraid that I'm going to die if I take psychedelics. You know, hey, you should look forward to it. You know, this is part of the change process. You got to have something die before you can create something new as an identity. And Charles Laughlin, I think, has talked about it in his brain symbol experience as a archetypal drive towards holotropism that allows the emergence of a new transcendent identity. Pivotal mental states, beginning with the idea that shamanic initiation presents symptoms that resemble psychosis and hysteria, which is different than saying that it's a psychotic or hysterical behavior. Although I think we probably could accept that the shaman initiate goes through an acute psychotic episode. But unlike a typical patient who becomes psychotic, the shaman flips the script. This is the idea of pivotal mental states, where chronic stresses trigger certain kinds of breakdowns that can also result in serotonergic responses that produce a psychological reintegration and transformation. So what they propose is that these states that are on one hand a crisis and a breakdown, on the other hand, provide an opportunity for rapid change and deep learning, not just the relaxation of prior assumptions that we see in psychedelic experiences, but sometimes a complete rejection of prior assumptions, a reversal of the basic learned pathways of association. So Carhart-Harris with Brower proposes that the 5-HT psychedelics, or serotonin activates this multi-level pathway, and psychedelics do that as well. I actually have a forthcoming article with Brower and one of his advisors, going to be on religion, brain, and behavior, in which we try to apply this model to understanding something about the evolution of shamanism and how shamanism in its core aspects might provide a significant tool for addressing acute psychosis and early stages of psychosis. I'm going to have to let you read this one. I got to keep moving here. How PMS gets activated. One of the ways in which shamanism produced this transformation was the incorporation of these animal identities. So you may recall the model. The shaman gets killed and eaten by the animals and then gets put back together by the animal. The same power that destroys you, you now incorporate, which is a pretty basic human psychological mechanism, which is played out in the humans wanting to be like powerful figures. We incorporate powerful figures into our personalities, even if there are abusers. Shamans incorporated the species to give them a hierarchy of control for dealing with a more differentiated psychosocial self. I talk about this in my shamanism book. So animal intelligence is an innate intelligence, and I think that this is something else we should pay more attention to in terms of trying to figure out more effective ways to utilize the psychedelic experience. This is an innate system of meaning. It can transform psychological and social relations. Levi-Strauss discussed this as totemism. It's a fundamental feature of human social evolution. And it allows us to use this innate animal intelligence as a symbol system to change ourselves as well as to transform our social groups. So rather than treating the spirit world as a delusional belief system, I think we should view it as neurognostic structures. There's a lot in Jungian psychology and the archetypes. I think that gives us a better way of understanding what these spirit experiences are like. I have an article, Spirits as Fundamental Structures of Human Consciousness, available on ResearchGate, in which I lay out what I think is a very sound developmental psychology argument for why it's normal for us to believe in spirits. And it has to do with our biopsychosocial structures, complexes of the unconscious, and the ability of the spirit concept to express our innate social intelligence. So once again, in this book with John, I have a chapter that looks at these innate intelligences as part of what constitutes the supernatural. So spirits are others. They provide very important models for how we behave. They're a form of social intelligences. They're not just embodied in supernatural thought and in entheogenic behaviors, but they play significant roles in self-development in pre-modern cultures around the world. They are a system within which we can internalize objectified roles and use them as models for our own identity and development. Shamans do that with animals, but any number of different kinds of beliefs allow for these kinds of changes. And I'm finishing up editing this book on entheogenic healing, and I was just struck with how so many of these traditions of entheogenic use view the entheogens as putting you in touch with a spirit entity that gives you a different set of directions about how you're supposed to behave. And of course, anthropology has recognized this for a long time, and there's probably literature and psychology about that. But the evolutionary psychology of religion is yet to effectively incorporate these perspectives. So, to sort of summarize this notion of shamanic ritual as best practices, how should we take the shamanic paradigm as a set of directions, guidelines for best practices in psychedelic medicine? The preparatory set, austerities. Maybe you don't need to beat yourself to death, but going out, by yourself in the desert, fasting, engaging in sexual abstinence, isolating yourself from others. This is what the shamans did. I think that this is an important set of guidelines. The setting, it's an overnight ritual and it's a communal ritual. Okay, so the whole psychedelic renaissance thus far is focused on one patient laying in a bed with two therapists, a male and a female, to make sure he doesn't get molested by either of them, right? Come on, this is not how shamans did the work. It's everybody coming together in a group at nighttime. There is a group dynamic that needs to be exploited. And if we take that group approach, we can help overcome one of the real impediments to the psychedelic renaissance as a therapeutic modality, which is one patient with two doctors for 24 hours is cost prohibitive. Okay, got to change that. We need to have a ritual setting that exploits the mimetic capacities. The John Hopkins programs use music. It has a carefully curated set of songs that are designed to induce Christian mystical experiences. As Rick Strassman has pointed out, it doesn't seem to work as well for Jewish people. But, music is important, as is dance, enactment, expressive behaviors. The set needs to be engaging our innate psychology. I think here about the animal relations. Maybe we ought to tell people to do a power animal search, a power animal recovery. How does this bring a new dynamic into your life, a new power, a new set of principles? If you don't think this makes any difference, try this experience. Spend the day acting like a mouse. See how people respond to you. Spend the day acting like a lion. See how people respond to you, okay? It has a big difference in how we behave and how others relate to us. Engage the visionary experiences not as hallucinations, but as symbols, as meaning to be acquired and to be later interpreted perhaps through the dream periods. Seek these other dynamics of altered states, the death and rebirth, the soul flight, the animal transformation. See the spirit world as being part of a natural set of psychological developments that can take these pivotal mental states, these periods of crisis, and turn them around. Engage in the capacity to elevate our ancient brain systems and bring them up into our consciousness, our awareness, and our bodies. So obviously I didn't do this as fast as I did once before. I'm going to put in a plug for this article here, an introduction to novel method of therapy, psychedelic somatic interactions, psychotherapy, in the new Journal of Psychedelic Psychiatry. I'm not even going to try to cover it. I think I'm just going to wrap it up there. I've done my hour and a little bit. I think I need to stop now and take questions, right?
Well, very good. Thank you very much, Michael. If you would like to leave your screen or share your screen so that we can see you big time. We're getting questions already. So we'll take our first question from Phil Stevens.
Hello, Michael. Phil
Hey,
Stevens.
Phil.
I've followed your career for more than 40 years, and I think this presentation was a beautiful summary. I have just one observation, and I like your response to it. At the very beginning, you made a generalization about ritual, saying something like ritual enhances ASC and then various chemicals to serotonin, dopamine, and endorphins. And then you went on and it became clear that you're talking about ritual that's accompanied by rhythmic motion, rhythmic music with percussion and so forth, because there are other, what we could call quiet rituals, deliberate rituals, like what a Catholic priest does during the Eucharist. So shouldn't you right up front define what sort of ritual you're talking about? That's my only suggestion. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, well, and thanks for the accolades, Phil. I appreciate it. I'm gonna try to do a lot better. Hopefully I'll stay after for a few more years. I guess, ritual to me is a very slippery term. And you're right, it probably needs to be more clearly defined, although most people who have tried to avoid ended up having to leave out things that others want in it. But to me, ritual has to be viewed primarily as a collective dynamic. To talk about a private or individual ritual, okay, but I think it misses the hominid origins. And I think the hominid origins is this social collective behavior. Certainly different kinds of rituals do different things. Participating in a Catholic mass does something different than participating in a shamanic ceremony. But I think if we could actually, get the saliva measurements, we would find that people going to Catholic mass probably also get the enhancement of the endorphins which is what Robin Dunbar's research on ritual has shown. You don't need to have, the really extensive drumming and dancing and singing to get the enhanced endorphins. Just getting people to engage in the same kinds of behaviors together, what we can call loosely a ritual, enhances the endorphin system. Then, of course, all the things about, the enhancement of serotonin and dopamine and the endocannabinoids certainly requires a different level of activation. And probably I should be qualifying ritual with shamanic type rituals along the way.
Thank you. Yeah, you make sense. That's right.
And you have a recent book out, right?
I do. It's going to be published in just a few weeks by Routledge. I'll send you the link.
All right. Shaman, it's on sorcery, right? Witchcraft?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, when Michael was talking about staying up all night and dancing and things, I had to think of raves. So we could describe the Electronic Daisy Carnival as perhaps one of the greatest shamanic gatherings on the planet in current times. And there's certainly a lot of psychoactive and psychedelic drugs going on. But I wanted to pose a question, or perhaps stage a little discussion between Reed Morrison, who gave our talk last week about exactly what has been going on at Johns Hopkins, and Michael, who noted that it's primarily Christian music. So Reed, would you like to respond to that, or perhaps give us a little more detail about the setting that's being used at Johns Hopkins?
Well, first of all, Michael, I've followed your work for a long time, and I'm a big fan. So it's wonderful just to be in your Zooming presence. I was at Hopkins for 3 years, and the music was originally put together by Helen Bonney, the music therapist, and Bill Richards, who many of you know. I don't. It's Western music.
Right. I shouldn't have said Christian. You're right. But Western spiritual music, I guess.
Western
maybe would have been
spiritual music, yeah.
Sure.
But now the world music, the later iterations have a lot of world music on it with chanting, and so I think that's shifting. There's a recognition that Western, sort of religious music does not do it for everyone, and some people now are bringing their own music, which may interfere with the research protocol, but so what? I think it's working.
Do we have other questions or comments?
Do I? Not really. I'm just I just really enjoyed this presentation. Wonderful.
Thanks.
Yes, we have Dawn has a question.
Hello, also a very big fan. I've had a copy of Supernatural Less Natural on my shelf for years. It's a little dog-eared copy. There's an area that I cannot find any literature on, and I refuse to believe it's not out there, because to me it's just so interesting. And I'm wondering, and I noted it here so I could ask you, is there evidence of psilocybin use in Paleolithic Europe amongst Neanderthals?
Well, at one level, we don't have any direct evidence of psilocybin use, up until relatively recently. And I guess it's a direct evidence because mushrooms don't fossilize. So probably the first time we can say that we have, direct evidence is when we see rock art or other kinds of, sculptures depicting mushrooms, and we're, not likely to think that they were just making a model of what they were going to cook for dinner.
Right.
But I think ultimately we may get evidence. And this is one of my long-term projects. I want to make like a great big chart. And on one side is all the areas of the brain that are differentially stimulated by psilocybin. And then on the other chart is, was this area of the brain something that either evolved in post-hominid separation or expanded under hominid evolution? And I keep finding more and more and more examples of, things that evolved in human evolution compared to chimps are the areas of the brain stimulated by psychedelics. Now, whether or not we can make those inferences about Neanderthals, I don't know. But at a certain point, I think we'll be able to. given our, common heritage at a number of different levels. Question would be, can we genetically time the changes that occurred in the development of specific areas of the brain? But,
And this is an area that really does need to be looked into then, from my perspective.
well, I mean, the thing is that, the kind of evidence we'd like to see isn't there, but at the same time, there's no evidence that humans, more than a few thousand years ago ever ate bananas. There's no fossilized human with a banana in its mouth. There's no banana fossilized, it's never going to turn up. And nobody doubts that humans ate bananas wherever they could get them, So I think the same reasoning ought to apply to the mushrooms,
Just
We were
because you
eating
can't
them.
see it doesn't mean it isn't there.
Right. But I think, to the extent we're going to be able to see it is going to be the extent to which we can infer it based upon specific features of human brain evolution in comparison to chimps.
Very intriguing.
Do we have some more questions?
If I could ask quickly, Michael, what, I missed something. What is DMT, those initials? What do they stand for?
Either dimethyltryptamine or dance movement therapy, but probably dimethyltryptamine,
Okay, okay.
the active ingredient in ayahuasca.
That's probably it. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, DMT, 5-MeO DMT, yeah.
More questions? Merdine?
Yes, thank you for the talk. It occurs to me that in the 60s, when I was reading up on Sami culture that was Lap at that time, I read several places that the Sami were the only people without dance. And of course, I ignored that and went there anyway. And what I saw as equivalent, definitely, to dance would be what the footwork that accompanies their yoik or their chant. And shamanistic practices as such exist, but not performatively. But then it occurred to me that almost any habitualized type of movement had to be included in a general sense of dance anyway, including how one walks with or without something on one's head. So thank you for your talk.
Yeah, the Sami is one of the groups that I want to learn more about. I was in Norway a few years back, and I actually went to a library, found about 50 articles, but I've never been able to get back to try to find the articles themselves. I just have the citations, but I think the Sami could be a really good example to show the evolution of shamanism, because we have records over about a 400-year period of time in terms of what the practices were like. I don't think they resemble anything like shamanism today, but I think if you go back far enough, the resemblances start to emerge, and they show us how Sami practices change as a consequence of the oppression.
Yes, thank you.
Do we have another question? Stanley, you want to unmute yourself? Stan, we can't hear you. Stan, can you hear me? We can't hear you. Can you unmute? There we go.
Yes,
Try it
okay.
again, please.
What you think about the argument that psychedelic plants foster the evolution of human brain?
Well, Stan, I think it's a very good hypothesis. I think it's almost an inescapable hypothesis. And I think ultimately, the evidence that we have so far is partially convincing. And I would refer to the Psychedelic Sociality and Human Evolution article that I did with Jose Arce. And I think, the point that I was just making about, what would be the evidence for this? I think we need to get somebody who's got, on one hand, a really good understanding of brain evolution, and someone else who has a really good understanding of psychedelic neurology. And I think the evidence for the evolution of the human brain under psychedelics is that the unique parts of the human brain are those areas preferentially stimulated by psychedelics. And the argument then would be that we evolved those parts of the advanced human brain because those of our ancestors who were most capable of utilizing psilocybin effectively were the ones that were most likely to, survive and reproduce. And in that sense, I like to throw out one of my favorite reworked sayings. Pat Nixon said, drugs are for people who can't handle reality. And what we said was, reality is for people who can't handle drugs. If you can handle drugs, you can change a lot about your reality.
Did that address your question, Stanley?
That's fine. Well, thank you.
Nice to see you, by the way.
Thank you. You too.
Other questions? Well, maybe we're all tapped out. Michael, would you like to say a few words in closing?
Well, I guess I would say that, if you wanted to see the last part of the talk, I have my new webpage up, michaelwinkleman.com. I have a bunch of videos there. The first part of the video, you've probably already seen the same thing, PowerPoint, I think, but then I have the part about the psychedelic somatic interactional therapy. And so you can see the rest there. And of course, I've got a lot of my articles and even a few of books or parts of books that are there on my website. So the articles have linked to ResearchGate or to other places where you can get them.
And I just put the link to the YouTube that Michael referred to in the chat for everyone to see. Oh, we have a question from Eileen. Hi, Eileen.
Hi, I just wanted to make a comment. I really loved your presentation. I'm currently a graduate student of archaeology, and this is my first exposure to evolutionary psychology. And I want to find a way to apply it to archaeology because it is just like very fascinating to me. So I just wanted to say that I've read maybe 5 of your papers, and honestly, I've never heard of you before 2 weeks ago, and I love your writing. So I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Well, thank you too. And there are a few books that have come out recently on the applications of evolutionary psychology to archaeology. I think one of them is written by Matt Rosano, but I bet if you go to, Amazon or one of these other online sites and put in evolutionary psychology, archaeology, yeah, people are there trying to apply these ideas in a lot of different ways.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Michael, I can't think of the name right now, the author that we used in our book where he's talking about how the walls between the various modules started to come down. That might be a resource for her. Is that Stephen Mithen?
Oh, Mithen.
Yeah.
Sure. A little dated, certainly worth going back and reading. He's trying to infer about cognition in Neanderthals. But, evolutionary psychology really only kind of started as a concept 30 years ago, only really took off in the last, 20 years. So it's slowly making its way into archaeology and cultural anthropology, I'm sure much to the cultural anthropologist resistance.
Yeah, I know a few examples. Well, if we don't have any other questions or comments, then we will wrap it up. I will begin by stopping the recording. And again, just for so you all know, I will provide the link to this recording in an email that I will send out to all of you once I get the link back myself. So expect that within, say, about 72 hours. So I'm going to stop the recording now.